we're going to take some time to learn a little bit about how to install and configure a switch. Now, the first step to installing a switch is to, well, get a switch. So we need to go and see about purchasing a switch and getting it. Now, purchasing a switch is a little harder than you might think because we've got to make sure we select the right switch for our job. And there are so many different choices that are out there. Let's take a look at Cisco's product line to get a good example. There's many different manufacturers that are out there. They all create various switches. On Cisco's side, they generally focus on enterprise and business switches. And so you'll see they have a number of different options. LAN switches, which are generally multi-purpose. You have core and distribution switches, which are designed for large enterprises and data centers, even ISPs. So some of these switches are very, very large. Others are designed for small business, like branch offices where you have a small amount of people. You need to understand where your switch is going to be used to select the right one because the cost on these vary significantly. A switch, like for example, a Linksys switch, could be as little as $50 at your local computer store, right? Here's a little 5-port switch for $37. Or a bigger switch, like a 48-port switch. Let's see if we can find one. Well, it's 24 ports, a decent density there. So a 24-port switch, this one is about $300, right? So each of those vary in price based on how many ports you're getting and how you intend to use it. When you start talking about some of these larger switches, they could be $100,000. That's not something you want to put in your home. It is something an ISP would need. So we have to select the right switch for the job. After we've picked the right switch, we have to figure out where we're going to put it. And when I say where we're going to put it, I don't mean like a core distribution layer. I mean where we're physically going to put it. There's a lot of different places that a switch can go. For example, if it's a standard desktop switch, you might take a desktop switch and mount it underneath your desk. Right? This is actually a picture from underneath my desk in my office. I've got a Netgear switch that I have a cable running in that's my main network cable, and then I split it to run to my computer and to my VoIP phone. So those two connections are kind of coming out here on the right side. Now, I know it looks upside down, and that's because I mounted it upside down. I wanted the cables to point upwards. On a switch, they generally don't care if they're pointed up or down, if they're upside down, upside right. But one thing we need to be considerate of is the way air flows through the switch. On a desktop switch, perfectly fine to mount it just like this, not a big deal. But on an enterprise switch, it can be a lot more challenging because you typically have a lot more density. And when I say density, let me show you another example here. This is an example of 5 48-port switches stacked on top of each other. They're all right down here towards the bottom of this photo. So you can kind of see them. They're a little hard to see because of all the cables that are coming out of them. Now, when we plug in cables at this density level, it's important that we cable manage them so that we can still visually see the switch. There's a lot of indicator lights on the front that if the cable blocks it, we can't see them. Another thing to consider is unlike servers, where air is normally taken in the front and blown out the back, so you have hot air coming out the backside of a server, switches and network gear is typically side to side. In other words, air is being sucked in from the left side and blown out to the right side. So if we mount these switches upside down or mount them next to another rack really close, we could be obstructing the airflow and not getting cool air into the switches, leading to an overheat situation. That's something you want to avoid. So how we place these is really important. Let me show you an example of a pretty typical wiring closet right here. It's a single rack that has a little bit of a ladder mounted on top of it. And that ladder is so we can have all the cables that run from all the various workstations on this particular floor are running to this one place. They come out of the ceiling and into the ladder. Now, I know it looks like the cables run way off to the right, but it's actually just a loop, and it comes right back again where they divide in half to run down the left and right side of the rack, where they then run in to these patch panels. Patch panels are an important part of getting a switch operation like this set up because you might need to move cables around. It is really hard to move cables down here where they're all cable managed and zip tied or Velcroed. I always recommend Velcro in place. With a patch panel, I can just unplug and move a connection, and now it's done up here where it's nice and easy. That's a great way to handle things there too. Notice how there's no real obstructions on the left or right side of these switches, so they have complete airflow that's able to move through. And there's even empty space at the bottom, knowing that if we add more machines, here there's we've got 3 48-port switches, so that's 120 some odd ports that we have available, and we can add more switches to that stack to increase it. Now, Once we figure out where we're going to put the switch, like in this case, it's a rack mounted switch, we'll screw that into the rack. It gets bolted into place. We provide it power. All right. So it's now on and we're ready to cable up our workstations. When we plug them in, you'll typically have more workstation ports, just what are considered access ports to plug them into. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, notice how some of these are orange and some of these are blue. People will often use colored cables to help identify what the device is. And I actually don't know in this particular picture, but maybe orange are VoIP phones and blue are computers. Or maybe it's that blue is one department and orange is another department. So it's a visual indicator that they're using. But there are some special cables you'll notice up here towards the top right, which are fiber optic. All right. In this case, these are typically going to be the trunks that connect these switches to the rest of the switching environment. And here I can see both of those cables are plugged into a blade right in this one switch, not into the other switches. So that means if this top switch were to fail, I would now lose connectivity to the main network from these other switches. That's not necessarily a good thing. If I go back to that other picture I showed you, this one, you can see where there's something similar here. I've got these two connectors up here on the one blade, but I've got another fiber connector here, another fiber connector here, and in fact, another two down here. So this is a little bit more of a redundant stack. It can handle additional nodes failing and allowing connectivity still going to the core, or this may even be the core, right? So those are all things that we need to be thinking about as we get this set up. Now, I mentioned we're going to power these on, right? So powering on the switch, if it's one big switch, it will likely have multiple power supplies, and those need to be plugged into ideally separate UPSs, which are then plugged into separate circuits. We're trying to plan for redundancy, right? If one circuit fails, the other circuit is still up, you're okay. If one UPS fails, the other is still up, you're okay. If one power supply fails, then so on. Many switches will have 4 or even 6 power supplies, especially if they do power over Ethernet. So you'll need the appropriate cabling for them. And be careful, some switches have plugs that look like standard computer D plugs, but actually have a little notch in them, which just designates they're a higher gauge. And that is important. You won't be able to plug a regular D plug into them. So make sure you have the right cabling to apply power to that. Once you've powered on the switch, if it is a standard layer 2 switch, you're done. The switch is ready to be used, okay? But if it is a more advanced switch, like a Cisco switch, you're going to have a little bit of work to do, right? So for example, here I've got a Cisco switch that I did a factory reset on it and I powered it on, okay? So when it powers on, you see a lot of different things going on if you connect to the console. And this is the same for an HP switch or Juniper or any other vendor out there. They all kind of work the same way. And when they power on, they go through various tests to verify the hardware is functional. And when they're done, you get dropped off at a prompt. And if you just want the switch to operate as a layer 2 switch, you're done, right? You start plugging things in and you're in business. But if you want to configure VLANs, divide up networks, assign a password, monitor statistics, all the things you can do with a managed switch, you will typically need to get in and configure it. And that might be via web interface, or it might be via a console connection like I'm doing right here on this Cisco switch. Now, if I press enter on my keyboard, it's going to see that this is a brand new switch, and it's going to offer to walk me through the initial configuration dialog. And wizards like these really help us to get the switches configured and up and running really fast. So I could say yes to that. It's going to ask me for some basic information. Do I want to do basic management? I'll say yes. And now I can give it a host name. Maybe this is my sales department switch or whatever it is that we want to call it. So you give it a name. I need to pick a password. So I'll punch in my password. I'll just say Cisco123. And my enable password, I'll do Cisco321. And my virtual terminal password, which probably won't actually get used, I'll do Cisco123 again. Do I want to configure SNMP, the Simple Network Management Protocol? This will allow me to pull statistics into some kind of reporting software. I don't have that set up right now, so I'm going to say no. I can always turn it on later. And then after that, it's going to give me a list of the ports and their current status. I see several of my ports are up. Many of them are down. Nothing's plugged into them. But it gives me a chance to verify, am I seeing links where I expect them to be, right? And that's kind of our last step. Once the switch is configured and up and running, we need to verify that it's functioning. And you can do that from the front of the switch. If we go back to like the pictures that I had, you'll see all these link lights. And the link lights are telling me whether or not a cable has a connection and it's up. Now be careful when you plug a node in. Some switches are running spanning tree protocol by default. You may get no light, or you may get an orange warning light for up to 30 seconds while it does loop detection, and then it goes green. So just because you don't see a link light right away doesn't necessarily mean you're out of luck. You might just need to be patient. But if you start to see green lights, most of them will start to flicker, showing that traffic is transiting, and now you know you're in good shape. If not, it's time to move into network troubleshooting. All right, well, here we got a great chance to see what it takes to get a switch, well, purchased, configured, and installed and operational in our environment.